Wriothesley, a character that honestly became my favorite Fontanian character at first sight, until the other characters slowly stole the attention in the Archon quest. So, I did videos on Navia, I did videos on Farina, and I'm going to do a character video on Arlecchino soon. But for now, it's time to dive back into Wriothesley and make statements I honestly should have made 2 months ago. So, I actually finished Wriothesley's story quest very recently, and it's a shame that I didn't finish it earlier because I could have had a lot of social commentary on it fresh during its release, but I think it's still relevant today. The problems that existed in Fontaine in patch 4.1 still exist right now and probably will continue to exist long after we leave the nation. Especially fresh off the Muskets and Roses event that explores the themes of justice. This is just going to be a casual video, so I hope you enjoy the rambling I'm about to do. We've learned about Wriothesley's past, and we've come to better understand the circumstances of the fortress during his story quest. He himself was a convicted killer, a killer of his own adopted parents. Those parents were child traffickers, so it was a terrible time all around. Wriothesley was sentenced to the fortress as a teenager when the prison was still a brutal, cruel, and inhumane place to be in, and he eventually rose to the top, becoming the new duke and transforming the fortress into a much better place. I don't have quite the words to describe this social structure, but if you do, then you get the idea. I really can't emphasize this point enough, though, because it's a change that fundamentally changes the justice system in Fontaine. The humanization of criminals and the establishment of a safe, equitable prison that guarantees basic human needs for inmates is, well, it affects society more than one might realize. Throughout our journey in Fontaine, we've met a lot of characters whom had a not-so-friendly relationship with the law at one point. And it's not necessarily that these characters were evil or malicious people, most of them were just victims of circumstance. As Wriothesley said in the story quest, you never know why people commit certain crimes until they share their story with you. And this started all the way back in Fontaine Act 1 with Linny, where we were immediately given the reason he and his siblings joined the Fatui. If there's one thing Fontaine teaches you, it's that things and people are often never what they seem. And now knowing the stories of Linny, Wriothesley, Callus and Navia, Valtrin, Veronique, Baptiste, and the others, chances are you could go to any old prisoner, ask them to give you their story, and you could get something equally tragic. The main problem in Fontaine, that almost always recurs when exploring the characters' conflicts of justice, is that the Fontanian institutions tend to fail its people over and over again. I mean, look no further than Navia and Callus. She straight up said it out loud, going to court would have been more dangerous than acting independently. I mean, we can forget about Vautrin, we can forget about the Musketeers, and we can forget about Chevreuse. We have Navia here, straight up calling out the nation's justice system.
Oh, please. Did you ever think I had any respect for this place's pointless theatrics? Had this opera house ever given my father any kind of confidence in its brand of justice, Spina di Rosula would have had no reason to exist.
And you know how I feel about Navia, okay? If my dear boss of Spina di Rosula makes a point, then this conversation is over. So around the time of 10 to 20 years ago in Fontaine, you had Vache and the Synth organization at their peak, a large human trafficking network which caught both Linny, Lynette, and Wriothesley's past, and a former fortress of Meripede which effectively amounts to a violent, controlled, corrupt anarchy, and who knows what else. Combine that with a terribly flawed justice system that effectively screwed over half the Fontaine playable cast, and what you have is the most vulnerable members of society getting abused by first the wealthy criminals, and then abused by the justice system that failed to protect them. This is reaching some real-life levels of cruelty here. It thus comes at absolutely zero surprise that Arlecchino recruits orphans in Fontaine. Let's consider an alternate history here. What if Arlecchino saved Wriothesley as a child? Well, she'd by extension save the other orphans' lives, and they'd all join the house. Wriothesley would be one of the knave's greatest child. He's intelligent, strong, and cunning. He has all the perfect ingredients to succeed her, and even become the next Fatui Harbinger, potentially. Linny, on the other hand, you could easily imagine this boy losing Lynette with no Arlecchino to save them, potentially disappearing forever because, well, that's what happened to Wriothesley's siblings. Seeing as how he reacted to Lynette disappearing in Act 4, you think he couldn't eventually track down Lynette's buyer and brutally destroy that person, and then get sentenced to the fortress before becoming the Duke? I find it incredibly interesting that you could reasonably have these two characters swap circumstances and still arrive at each other's conclusions. But, anyways, back on topic. We've established that there are criminals all over Fontanian society. The upper-class white-collar criminals push the lower-class victims into crime themselves. By transforming the fortress into the egalitarian society it's become today, Wriothesley has done something that the justice system could never provide on the surface. There are two statements about criminals that ring true based on circumstantial evidence. 1. A lot of criminals who commit crimes in moments of desperation are victims of circumstance. And 2. These criminals never led happy lives even before the crime and conviction, so evidently a release means nothing to most of them, especially the ones who choose to stay in the fortress. What this means for the victims of circumstances are that the prison feels less like a prison and more like a refuge. Think about it. If you were some homeless kid on the street, you have to deal with rich people trying to sell you off to who knows where in exchange for shelter. The prison would seem like a paradise in comparison. Or if you're some victim of the synth cartel and you're completely alone and isolated, again, if anything, your life in prison would actually improve over staying on the surface. You get welfare meals, you get a place to stay, you get a bunch of other prisoners who understand your situation, or at the very minimum, they wouldn't judge. The courts still need to function according to the law and sentence people as needed, yet the results themselves are very different depending on the person. You know, for example, that Maurice is going to suffer in there, and the two musketeers, Baptiste and Veronique, will probably be well received. Anyways, what does this tell us about Wriothesley's regime? The changes in the fortress are significant because being sentenced guilty in court no longer entails punishment. The court still retains all the aesthetics of judgment and moral superiority, but one could genuinely feel that life for these convicts might be even worse if they remained on the surface. The system on the surface of Fontaine is deeply flawed. The rulings under the Oratrice were heavily influenced by public opinion, and people of higher status and wealth seem to have endless resources to evade conviction. However, the fortress becomes the great equalizer. If the prisoner is a victim of circumstance, then they'll likely do fine. If the prisoner is somebody like Dugier or Maurice or Vacher who chooses to destroy lives for personal gain, well, they'll do much worse. So in that sense, you could say that the fortress is the only place where true justice can be delivered for the guilty. So that's all I have for this video. It's not as fancy as my past videos, but I had something to talk about here and I chose to do it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.